Most, if not all of us, have learned about the events surrounding the Boston Tea Party during our time in school. For those who don't recall, in 1773, tensions were high between American colonists and the British. According to Columbia Electronic Encyclopedia's entry about the event, after ongoing conflict, the colonists staged a protest known infamously as the Boston Tea Party, in which a group led by Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and several others disguised themselves as Native Americans and boarded 3 ships importing tea. They then threw that tea overboard into the harbor. There was much fallout as a result of the colonists' protest. Though many remember the story of the Boston Tea Party, it is not often remembered why it happened in the first place. The colonists' reason for protesting was to prevent consignees from accepting a tea tax, which had already been implemented in New York and Philadelphia. They believed this tax was unjust and refused to sit idly by while it was being implemented in major cities, as well as Boston.
In essence, the Boston Tea Party, a pivotal event in American history, was an act of American colonial defiance to taxation without representation. In the mid-18th century, tea from China became a very valuable and important import, displacing cotton goods. By 1773, the American people were consuming an estimated 1.2 million pounds of imported tea each year. By 1773, nearly 90% of all tea sold in America was being imported illegally from the Dutch. In response, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act on April 27, 1773, and on May 10, 1773, King George III placed his royal assent on this act. The major purpose of the passage of the Tea Act was to keep the East India Company from going bankrupt. When the British Parliament proposed the Tea Act, there was a belief that the American people would not object in any form to being able to purchase cheaper tea. However, the people would view this act as taxation without representation. As read in an article entitled, "What Led to the Boston Tea Party" by Martin Kelly. After the enactment of the Tea Act, the India Company shipped its tea to several different colonial ports, including New York, Charleston, and Philadelphia, all of which refused to let the shipment come ashore and sent it back to England. In December 1773, 3 ships named the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver arrived in Boston Harbor carrying East India Company tea. The American people demanded that the tea be turned away and sent back to England. However, the Massachusetts governor, Thomas Hutchinson, refused to heed to the people's demands. This then led to the dumping of 342 chests, 45 tons of tea, which today would equivalent to $1 million. The incident, famously known as the Boston Tea Party, was one of the leading acts of defiance by the American people that would come to fuel rage a few years later in the Revolutionary War.
A group of tradesmen and colonial merchants, known as the Sons of Liberty, protested the Stamp Act as well as taxation without representation. The Sons of Liberty were led by Samuel Adams. They also included Patrick Henry, Benedict Arnold, and Paul Revere. They did not agree that the tea should be taxed, which led to the protest known as the Boston Tea Party. On December 16th of 1773, the Sons of Liberty headed down to Griffin's Wharf, where 3 British East India Company ships, known as the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were loaded with tea from China and were at dock. They managed to pull off the events of that night by communicating with each other, and they agreed to wear clothes and disfigure themselves, dressing to resemble Indians as much as possible. They would smear their faces with grease and lamp soot and black. They should have not known each other except for by their voices. And that was according to Joshua Wythe in Recollections of a Revolutionary, excerpt from the American History Journal of June 2010. He went on to state that that was the most exhausting night of his life. The Sons of Liberty boarded the 3 ships, where they ordered the captain and the crew to go below deck while they used their axes and tomahawks to break open the chests of tea and dump them overboard. They threw nearly 342 chests of tea into the Boston harbor that night. According to the Defiance of the Patriots, the Boston Tea Party and the Making of America, published in the summer of 2012 by Richard Bell, the total amount combined between all of the chests held more than 92,600 pounds of tea. This act was the catalyst that led America towards their independence.
The Boston Tea Party was a move that proved the colonists were not going to be pushed around. Many of the Boston Tea Party participants fled Boston immediately after the destruction of the tea to avoid being arrested. Parliament called it vandalism, and England's attorney generally officially charged a number of Patriot leaders, including Samuel Adams and John Hancock, with the crime of a high treason and a high misdemeanor, even though there is no proof of them participating in the protest. For weeks after the Boston Tea Party, the Boston harbor smelled as a result of 92,000 pounds of tea being dumped into the harbor. To keep looters from salvaging, the British East India Company tea dumped into the Boston harbor. The Sons of Liberty would go out in boats and hit the tea with oars and clubs in an attempt to sink it in hopes of making the tea useless. The news of the Boston tea reached London, England, on January 20th of 1774, and as a result, the British shut down the Boston harbor until all of the 340 chests of the British East India Company's tea was paid for. American colonists responded with protests and coordinated resistance by convening the first Continental Congress in September and October of 1774 to petition British to repeal the Intolerable Acts. They were eventually legal repercussions for the Boston Tea Party. It took a few months, but the Parliament soon cracked down on Boston.
Hearing all the information surrounding the events before, during, and after the Boston Tea Party really kind of sheds light on why these colonists reacted the way they did in this situation. The colonists knew their actions could be met with backlash, criminal charges, or the possibility of even worse consequences. But despite all of this, they chose to do what they felt was right for themselves and what was best for the people of Boston. In the end, their actions pushed the prospect of American independence to the forefront, inspiring even more people to rebel against British rule. This led to even more support than was previously had for the separation from the British. Doing something revolutionary is never easy or absent of fear. There is an uncertainty that comes with making bold moves as these men did. It takes a passionate person or group of people to do what they did. With this in mind, what lengths would you go to in order to change something that you felt very strongly about?